US and Israel erase Iran's entire air defense. Tehran erupts. Not one battery left standing, not one radar still transmitting, not one missile site still breathing. In less than 72 hours, the most layered air defense network in the Middle East was reduced to smoke and silence. Tehran is in chaos. The region is holding its breath. But here is the question no one is asking out loud. Was this the end of a confrontation, or the opening move of something far larger? Welcome back to Hidden Economy, where we go beyond the headlines and show you the forces that truly shape our world. If this is your first time here, you are in exactly the right place, and we are genuinely glad you found us. We cover the stories that matter with the depth and honesty you deserve. Take a moment, hit that subscribe button, and become part of a community that values truth over noise. It means more than you know. Now, before we go further, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. We read every single one. The United States and Israel had been building their forces quietly, ships moving into position, aircraft carriers cutting through the Persian Gulf, fighter jets running silent patrol routes high above international waters. The message was clear. The patience was running out. But Iran did not blink. And then, on one ordinary morning above the Persian Gulf, everything changed. A U.S. Navy F-35C Lightning II was on a standard patrol flight, 25,000 feet above the water, engines humming, instruments calm. The pilot had flown this route before. He knew the risks. He was trained for them. Then his cockpit erupted with warning signals. An Iranian Corded-15 surface-to-air missile battery, positioned along the Iranian coastline, had achieved a hard lock on his aircraft. Within seconds, 2 missiles were in the air, accelerating to over 3,000 miles per hour, climbing fast, hunting the American jet. The pilot pulled hard. 7 times the force of gravity crushed him into his seat as he fought to break the missile's targeting seeker away from his aircraft's heat signature. His wingman was not fast enough. A proximity fuse on the second Iranian missile triggered just meters from the wingman's aircraft. A burst of tungsten shrapnel tore through the F-35C's horizontal stabilizer. The aircraft shuddered violently and limped away from the engagement zone, damaged but still flying. Back at the combat information centers aboard U.S. Navy destroyers in the Gulf, commanders stared at their screens. The execute order had been sitting on the terminal for 14 days. Now, someone turned the key. This moment did not come out of nowhere. The Hidden Economy audience needs to understand the full picture, because the headline only tells half the story. For 21 days before this incident, the United States and its allies had been deliberately holding back. Diplomatic channels were still open. Back-channel conversations were happening behind closed doors. Washington and Tel Aviv both understood that an open military confrontation with Iran carried enormous risks, not just for the region, but for global energy markets, oil prices, and the broader world economy. They chose patience first. A massive amount of military hardware was moved into the region, not to attack, but to signal. Carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, electronic warfare aircraft. The message was strategic. Stand down, take the off-ramp, end the escalation cycle before it becomes irreversible. Iran read that patience differently. In Tehran, the restraint shown by Washington was interpreted not as diplomacy, but as hesitation, not as strategy, but as weakness. Iranian military commanders reportedly continued to operate their air defense systems aggressively, tracking and locking onto U.S. aircraft during patrol flights. Each time, the Americans pulled back without firing. Until now. The moment the Iranian missile connected with the American aircraft, the calculation changed completely. Within hours, the USS Arleigh Burke, one of the most capable guided missile destroyers in the world, fired the opening salvo. Its vertical launch system cells blew open on the forward deck, and a volley of weapons rose into the sky above the Persian Gulf. Simultaneously, a flight of FA-A-18E Super Hornets launched from the USS Abraham Lincoln. They dropped low, just 200 feet above the wave tops, flying beneath the detection range of Iranian long-range search radars along the coast. Their first target was not a city. It was not a military base. It was Iran's eyes. The Iranian Corded-15 radar systems along the coastline, the same systems that had just locked onto American aircraft, were the first to be destroyed. Because without radar, Iran's entire air defense network was blind. And a blind air defense system is not a system at all. It is just expensive equipment waiting to be erased. That was the opening move. And as the Hidden Economy team will show you in Part 2, the weapons used, the systems deployed, and the precision of what followed was unlike anything the region had seen before. Most people watched the news and saw explosions. The Hidden Economy audience is going to understand what those explosions actually meant. Because what happened over the Persian Gulf was not simply a military strike. It was a carefully engineered sequence, a technical masterpiece built from years of planning, billions of dollars of research, and some of the most sophisticated weapon systems ever deployed in a real combat environment. And every single piece of it worked exactly as designed. The first problem Iran had, and never solved, Iran's air defense network was built on a simple philosophy. Layer everything. They had Russian-supplied S-300 long-range missile batteries covering high-altitude threats. They had domestically produced corded 15 systems handling medium-range engagements. They had short-range point defense weapons protecting critical infrastructure. On paper, it looked formidable. On paper, it looked like a wall no aircraft could penetrate. But every radar system in the world shares one fatal weakness. The moment it turns on, it announces itself. Every radar transmits electromagnetic energy outward to detect targets. That same energy bounces back and reveals the radar's exact location to anyone listening carefully enough. Iranian operators knew this. They trained for it. They tried to minimize their emissions and operate in short, controlled bursts to avoid detection. It was not enough. The weapon that hunts radar. The U.S. Navy's FA-18E Super Hornets approaching the Iranian coastline at just 200 feet above the water were not carrying ordinary bombs. They were carrying the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile, known simply as the HARM. This weapon does something remarkable. It does not need a human to identify a target. It does not need coordinates programmed in advance. The HARM simply listens. It picks up the specific electronic frequency of an enemy radar system, like recognizing a voice in a crowded room, and locks on to that signal as its target. The moment an Iranian radar operator switched on his fire control system to track an incoming aircraft, he unknowingly sent a homing beacon directly to a missile traveling at Mach 2, roughly 500 miles per hour. He had no warning. He had no time. His radar van simply ceased to exist. The shoreline erupted in a chain of secondary explosions as HARM missiles found their targets one by one, walking down the Iranian coastal defense line and turning each radar installation into a burning wreck. Within minutes, the integrated air defense network that Iran had spent decades building was reduced to a collection of isolated blind outposts, each one cut off from the others, unable to communicate, unable to coordinate, unable to fight effectively. The bombers that flew under the floor. While the coastal radar systems were being destroyed, a separate operation was already underway deeper inside Iranian territory. U.S. Air Force B-1B Lancer bombers, massive supersonic aircraft capable of carrying enormous weapons loads, released a volley of AGM-158 joint standoff missiles, known as JSMs. These are terrain-hugging cruise missiles. They do not fly high and fast like a ballistic missile. They fly low and slow, skimming just above the ground, following the contours of valleys and riverbeds, staying beneath the minimum detection floor of Iran's S-300 radar systems. Iranian radar operators were scanning the sky. These missiles were moving through the valleys below them. The S-300, one of the most respected air defense systems in the world, never saw them coming. The command nodes and logistical supply depots that Iran relied upon to coordinate its military response were struck before a single alarm sounded in Tehran. Israel's calculated deception. Simultaneously, Israeli Air Force F-35I Adir squadrons executed an approach that violated conventional military doctrine entirely. They did not come from the sea, where Iranian coastal radar operators were expecting them. Instead, Israeli pilots flew a terrain masking profile through the Zagros mountain range, keeping their aircraft just 50 feet above the rocky terrain, invisible to long-range sensors. Iranian air defense operators at Asaluya saw nothing but ghost returns on their screens, confused signals, meaningless noise. Then moments before the Israeli jets reached their targets, U.S. EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft and Israeli ground-based jamming units flooded Iranian radar frequencies simultaneously with digital noise. The S-300 batteries were fed false information, a massive phantom bomber formation approaching from the opposite direction, from the sea. Iranian crews swiveled their launchers toward the water, toward a threat that did not exist. The real strike package was already rising from behind the mountain ridges directly behind them. Why sequence defeated firepower. What the hidden economy audience must understand is this. Iran did not lose because its weapons were inferior. Iran did not lose because its soldiers were not trained. Iran lost in this engagement because it was outthought, systematically, deliberately, and at every level simultaneously. The Americans and Israelis did not simply attack harder. They attacked in the right order. Blind the eyes first, silence the communications second, strike the economy third, intercept the response fourth. Every layer of Iranian defense was addressed before it could be used. Every potential countermove was anticipated before it could be executed. In modern warfare, as the hidden economy team has studied across conflict after conflict, sequence beats firepower every single time. Part 3 is where the real consequences begin to surface. The economic devastation, the regional shockwaves, and the perspectives that the mainstream coverage is not giving you nearly enough attention. When the smoke finally began to rise over the Persian Gulf, most television networks focused on the military story. The aircraft, the missiles, the radar systems turned to ash. But the hidden economy audience knows something that most casual news viewers do not. In the modern world, the most devastating blow you can deliver to a nation is not always military. Sometimes, the most devastating blow is economic. And what happened at Asaluya was not just a military strike, it was a financial amputation. The heart. They destroyed Asaluya is not a name that appears often in Western news coverage. Most people have never heard of it. But inside Iran, inside the offices of every government minister, every military commander, every proxy network stretching from Baghdad to Beirut to Sana'a, that name means everything. The Asaluya petrochemical complex sits on the northern shore of the Persian Gulf. It processes and exports natural gas and petrochemical products drawn from South Pars, the largest natural gas field on the planet, shared between Iran and Qatar. This single facility generates a staggering portion of Iran's entire export revenue. It does not just power Iran's economy, it funds Iran's influence across the entire Middle East. Every rocket fired by Hezbollah in Lebanon, every drone launched by Houthi forces in Yemen, every militia operating in Iraq and Syria. The funding chain that connects Tehran to all of these groups runs directly through the revenue generated at facilities like Asaluya. When Israeli F-35I Adir jets destroyed the distillation towers at that complex, not the storage tanks, but the massive 200-foot custom-built processing towers that take decades to replace, they did not just damage a building, they cut the financial lifeline of an entire regional network. The economic shockwave. The immediate consequences began registering within hours. Iran's currency, the rial, which had already been under severe pressure from years of international sanctions, dropped sharply as news of the Asaluya destruction spread through financial markets. Traders and analysts who follow Iranian energy exports understood immediately what the loss of those distillation towers meant. This was not damage that could be repaired in months. The specialized equipment destroyed, the custom-built distillation towers operating under enormous pressure, the subterranean gas feed manifolds ruptured from below, the cooling infrastructure simultaneously destroyed by U.S. Tomahawk missiles, represented billions of dollars in infrastructure that Iran, under current international sanctions, would struggle enormously to replace. Engineers who have studied the facility have noted that the combination of internal pressure ruptures and the destruction of the seawater cooling systems caused a thermal seizure across large sections of the plant. The steel structures did not simply burn. They warped and fused together in the extreme heat, turning the ground itself into a landscape of molten metal and destroyed foundations. Rebuilding by most independent estimates would take years, not months, and that assumes Iran could even source the necessary components under existing international sanctions. The proxy network feels the cut. The consequences did not stay inside Iran's borders. Within days of the strike, analysts monitoring Hezbollah's financial flows reported signs of strain. The organization, which receives an estimated $1 billion annually from Tehran, began showing indicators of resource pressure. Scheduled weapons shipments were reportedly delayed. Operational communications from Iranian-backed militias in Iraq suggested that emergency budget reviews were underway. This is the hidden economy that most coverage misses entirely. Military strikes generate dramatic footage. Burning facilities produce powerful images. But the real story, the story that the hidden economy audience understands, plays out in the financial pipelines, the weapons procurement budgets, the monthly payments to thousands of militia fighters across 5 countries who suddenly find their salaries delayed or reduced. When the money slows, the influence shrinks. When the influence shrinks, the regional balance shifts. And when the regional balance shifts, every government from Riyadh to Ankara to Tel Aviv recalculates its position. Competing perspectives. What different voices are saying. It would be dishonest, and the Hidden Economy team is committed to honesty above everything, to present this story from only one angle. From the American and Israeli perspective, the strikes represented a necessary and proportionate response to Iranian aggression. The engagement of a U.S. military aircraft by Iranian air defense systems was viewed as a direct act of hostility that could not go unanswered without permanently damaging the credibility of American deterrence in the region. From the Iranian government's perspective, the strikes represented an illegal act of aggression against sovereign Iranian territory and civilian infrastructure. Iranian state media described the attack on Asaluya as an act of economic warfare, deliberately designed to impoverish ordinary Iranian citizens, not just to target military capability. From the perspective of regional Arab governments, many of whom maintain complicated relationships with both Iran and the United States, the destruction of Iranian air defense capability created a new regional reality. A Iran that cannot protect its own airspace is a fundamentally different strategic actor than the Iran that existed 1 week earlier. From the perspective of ordinary Iranian civilians, the consequences are perhaps the most painfully concrete. Asaluya's output directly influenced domestic fuel prices, heating gas availability, and employment for tens of thousands of Iranian workers and their families. The destruction of that infrastructure does not punish a government in isolation. It sends economic shockwaves through the daily lives of ordinary people who had no vote in the decisions their government made. That reality deserves acknowledgement. It always does. What this moment actually means. The Hidden Economy team has tracked economic warfare across dozens of conflicts over many years, and one pattern emerges consistently. When a nation's economic infrastructure is destroyed faster than it can be rebuilt, and faster than international sympathy can mobilize meaningful support, that nation faces a fundamental choice: escalate further at enormous additional cost, or recalculate entirely. Iran still possesses significant military capability. It still has allies. It still has options. But the destruction of Asaluya changed the mathematics of every future decision made in Tehran in a way that no air defense missile battery ever could. Because missiles can be replaced relatively quickly, the economic foundation that pays for those missiles is far harder to rebuild. Every conflict in history has had a moment, a single point in time where the situation shifted so completely, so permanently, that nothing that followed could ever return to what came before. Historians argue about where those moments are for years afterward, but the people living through them often sense it in real time. Something fundamental has changed. The old rules no longer apply. A new calculation has begun. The Persian Gulf is at one of those moments right now, and the Hidden Economy audience deserves an honest, clear-eyed look at what comes next. The questions worth asking before looking forward, there are questions every informed viewer should be sitting with right now. The first question is this: was the destruction of Iran's air defense network a finishing move or an opening one? Military analysts have noted for years that Iran's strategic doctrine is built around the concept of the forward defense, the idea that Iran does not wait for threats to reach its borders. It projects influence outward through proxy networks, through economic leverage, through the constant low-level pressure of regional destabilization. Destroying air defense systems damages Iran's ability to protect itself. But it does not automatically dismantle the forward defense doctrine. Iran can still operate through proxies. It can still pursue asymmetric responses. The question of whether this strike ended a confrontation or simply changed its shape remains genuinely open. The second question is economic. Global energy markets are watching the Persian Gulf with extraordinary attention right now. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day, sits at the center of this confrontation. Any further escalation that threatens shipping through that strait would send oil prices sharply higher within hours. That means higher fuel prices, higher transportation costs, higher prices for almost every manufactured product that moves by ship. The economic consequences of this confrontation are not contained inside Iran's borders. They have the potential to reach the fuel pump of every ordinary family watching this video right now, wherever in the world they may be. The third question is political. How do regional governments respond to a fundamentally weakened Iran? Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states have spent years walking a careful diplomatic line, maintaining working relationships with Tehran, while also deepening security cooperation with Washington and Tel Aviv. A significantly weakened Iran changes the regional balance in ways that are not entirely predictable. Power vacuums in the Middle East have historically been filled, not always by stabilizing forces. What happens next? The realistic outlook. Iran will not simply absorb this blow and move on quietly. That is not how governments, particularly governments built around ideological resistance narratives, respond to public humiliation at this scale. The destruction of Asaluya and the collapse of the air defense network will generate enormous internal pressure within Tehran. Hardline factions within the Iranian government will push for visible retaliation, something that can be presented to the Iranian public as proof that the country has not been defeated. That retaliation, when it comes, is unlikely to be conventional. Analysts monitoring Iranian strategy expect the response to follow several possible tracks. Cyber attacks against American and Israeli financial infrastructure represent one avenue. Iran has invested heavily in offensive cyber capability over the past decade. Acceleration of uranium enrichment activities represents another, a signal to the international community that military pressure will not produce nuclear concessions. Activation of proxy networks for targeted operations against American interests in Iraq and Syria represents a third. None of these responses carry the same dramatic visual impact as a missile strike, but any one of them could trigger the next escalation cycle. The international community is aware of this dynamic. Behind closed doors, diplomatic efforts from European governments, Qatar, which shares the South Pars gas field with Iran and has enormous economic incentive to prevent further regional instability, and certain Asian governments with deep energy trade relationships with Tehran are reportedly underway. Whether those efforts gain traction before the next escalation move is made remains the central uncertainty of the coming weeks. What you can do? Staying genuinely informed. The Hidden Economy team believes strongly that an informed audience is the most powerful force in any democracy. On a story this complex, touching military doctrine, energy economics, regional geopolitics, and international law simultaneously, it is genuinely difficult to stay accurately informed from headline reading alone. A few practical suggestions for the hidden economy audience. Follow energy market data directly. The price movements in Brent crude oil and natural gas futures will often signal escalation developments before news coverage catches up. When traders who have billions of dollars at stake start moving their positions, they are usually responding to information worth paying attention to. Seek out Iranian domestic sources where possible. Organizations that monitor Persian language media and Iranian state broadcasting provide a perspective on how this confrontation is being framed for ordinary Iranian citizens, a perspective that is almost entirely absent from Western coverage, but deeply important for understanding how Tehran's decision makers are managing their internal political pressures. Watch the Strait of Hormuz shipping data. Maritime tracking services publish real-time vessel movement data that shows exactly how much commercial shipping is transiting the strait. Any significant drop in transit numbers would be an early warning signal of escalating risk that markets and governments would respond to very quickly. Stay with hidden economy. This story is not over, it is evolving. And the team here is committed to bringing the audience the full picture. Not just the dramatic moments, but the economic undercurrents, the financial consequences, and the human realities that most coverage leaves behind. A final thought. There's a line that stayed with the hidden economy team throughout the research for this story. A senior military strategist once said that the most expensive weapon in the world is not a missile. It is the decision to fire one. Because every missile launched carries with it not just the cost of the weapon itself, but the cost of what comes next. The retaliation it invites, the escalation it begins, the economic damage it unleashes on ordinary people who never sat in any military planning room and never voted for any of the decisions that put them in the path of consequences they did not choose. The Persian Gulf today is quieter than it was 72 hours ago. But quiet is not the same as resolved. The hidden economy audience understands the difference. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay with us. Because the story behind this story is only beginning to surface. If this coverage gave you genuine value, share it with someone who deserves the full picture. Drop your thoughts, your questions, and your location in the comments below. The hidden economy community reads every single one.